At Thanksgiving dinner, my mom called me a freeloader and said I had to be out by December. I quietly packed, canceled every bill in my name, and left. The next morning, he showed up furious at my apartment. I, 32M, left home after my mom called me a freeloader at Thanksgiving. She showed up the next morning when everything crashed. I had been living in my childhood home for the past 4 years, and I knew how it looked from the outside. A 32-year-old man still living with his parents. Classic freeloader material, right? Except that wasn't the full story, not even close. But when my mom stood up at Thanksgiving dinner in front of my aunt, uncle, and cousins and announced that I was a lazy freeloader who needed to be out by December, I realized she'd never actually understood what I'd been doing there at all. Let me back up. 4 years ago, my dad had a stroke. Not a massive one, but enough to leave him with limited mobility on his left side and some cognitive issues that made managing finances nearly impossible. My mom had never handled the bills. Dad had always taken care of that stuff. And suddenly she was overwhelmed. I had just started a decent job in IT consulting that let me work remotely, so I made a decision. I moved back home to help. I didn't just help. I took over everything. The mortgage, the utilities, the insurance, the property taxes. I put them all in my name because my parents' credit was shot from some bad decisions years ago, and we were able to get better rates with my score. I paid for the internet upgrade Dad needed for his virtual physical therapy sessions. I covered the streaming services, the lawn care, the pest control. I even bought the groceries most weeks because Mom's arthritis made shopping difficult. My parents paid me rent, sure, $300 a month. That didn't even cover a quarter of the actual expenses, but I never said anything. Dad was on disability, Mom worked part-time at a retail job, and I made enough to cover the difference. I figured I was investing in their comfort and security. They'd raised me, after all. This was me paying it back. But somewhere along the way, my mom had convinced herself of a different narrative. To her, I was the adult son who never launched, who couldn't make it on my own, who was mooching off his elderly parents. She made comments here and there over the years, little digs about when I was going to get my own place or find a girlfriend, but I brushed them off. I thought she was just frustrated with the situation, with Dad's limitations, with getting older. Thanksgiving dinner proved me wrong. We were sitting around the table, me, my parents, my aunt and uncle, and their 2 adult kids, when my cousin mentioned she'd just gotten engaged. Everyone congratulated her, and then my aunt made some comment about how nice it would be when all the kids were settled down and out on their own. She looked at me when she said it, and I saw my mom's face tighten. Mom set down her fork and said it was funny my aunt should mention that, because she'd been meaning to make an announcement. She said she and Dad had decided it was time for me to stand on my own 2 feet. She said I'd been living there rent-free for 4 years, taking advantage of their generosity, and that I needed to be out by the end of December so they could reclaim their space and their independence. The table went silent. My dad looked confused, opening his mouth like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite form the words. I just stared at my mom, feeling like I'd been punched in the chest. My aunt asked if I was really not paying rent, and Mom said no, of course not. They'd been supporting me this whole time like I was still a teenager. My uncle made some comment about tough love being necessary sometimes. My cousins just looked uncomfortable. I didn't argue. I didn't list out everything I'd been paying for or defend myself. I just excused myself from the table, went to my room, and started packing. The thing about working in IT is you get pretty good at logistics and planning. I had a system in place within an hour. I'd been casually looking at apartments for a few months, just browsing, thinking maybe it was time to eventually transition my parents to managing their own affairs again now that Dad had mostly stabilized. I'd even put down a deposit on a place 3 weeks earlier, planning to move in January. I called the landlord that night and asked if I could move in immediately. He said the place was empty and ready, so I could come get the keys the next morning. Then I started the real work. I pulled up every account that was in my name. The electric company, the gas company, the water and sewage, the internet and cable, the security system, the mortgage that I'd refinanced 2 years ago to get a better rate. I scheduled disconnection or transfer for every single one, effective in 3 days. The companies that required account holder authorization, I provided it. The ones that would just shut off after non-payment, I simply removed my automatic payments. I packed everything that was mine. My furniture, my electronics, my clothes, my books. I'd accumulated a lot over 4 years, but I was methodical. By 2 in the morning, I had most of it boxed up in the garage, ready to load into a moving truck. I left a note on the kitchen table. It was brief. I wrote that I was respecting her wishes and moving out immediately. I included a list of every bill that had been in my name, along with the account numbers and customer service numbers for each company. I noted that all services would be disconnected or transferred out of my name within 72 hours, and they would need to set up new accounts. I mentioned that the mortgage was in my name and they would need to refinance immediately or risk foreclosure. I wished them well. Then I left. I rented a truck at dawn, loaded everything, and drove to my new apartment across town. By noon on Friday, I was moved in. I took the rest of the day to unpack the essentials and set up my internet for work. I felt numb, moving through everything on autopilot. Saturday morning, I woke up to my phone exploding with missed calls and texts. 17 calls from my mom, 9 from my dad, even a few from my aunt. I ignored them while I made coffee and started setting up my living room. Then someone started pounding on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw my mom, her face red and furious. I considered not answering, but I knew she'd just keep making a scene. I opened the door, but didn't invite her in. She launched into me immediately. She asked what the hell I thought I was doing, whether I had any idea what I'd done. I asked her calmly what she meant. She said I'd turned off all the utilities, that they'd woken up to no internet, and when she tried to call the cable company, they said the account was closed. She tried to check the other bills online and discovered I'd scheduled everything to be shut off. I told her I was respecting her wishes. She told me to leave and call me a freeloader, so I left and took my freeloading with me. She said I was being ridiculous, that I knew she didn't mean I should take the bills with me. I asked her what exactly she thought would happen when I moved out of a house where everything was in my name. She said I was being vindictive and cruel. She said my father was upset and confused. She demanded I come back and fix everything immediately. I told her I wasn't coming back and that she had the information she needed to set up her own accounts. She said they couldn't afford to set up all those accounts with deposits and fees, that their credit was bad, that I knew that. I said that wasn't my problem anymore. She'd made it clear she thought I was taking advantage of them, so now they could handle their own affairs like the independent people they wanted to be. She called me selfish and ungrateful. She said after everything they'd done for me, this was how I repaid them. That's when I lost the calm facade. I told her I'd spent 4 years paying their bills, covering their expenses, managing their household while working full-time and putting my own life on hold. I told her I'd paid for nearly everything while they contributed $300 a month and convinced themselves they were supporting me. I told her I'd done it happily because I loved them and wanted to help, but apparently my help looked like freeloading to her. She went pale. She said she didn't know I was paying for all of that. I asked her what she thought was happening, how she thought a mortgage got paid, utilities stayed on, internet got upgraded. She said she thought I was paying rent to them, that the $300 was just a contribution, that Dad must have been handling the rest from his disability. I told her Dad's disability barely covered their medications and basic needs, which she would know if she'd ever actually looked at their finances instead of assuming. She started crying then, saying she didn't understand, that this wasn't what she meant to happen. I told her it was too late. The bills were scheduled to shut off, the mortgage was in my name, and I wasn't going to keep paying it for a house I didn't live in. She needed to figure it out herself. She begged me to at least keep the utilities on until they could sort it out, that it would take weeks to get everything transferred with their credit issues. I hesitated. Despite everything, the thought of my dad sitting in a cold house with no internet for his therapy sessions got to me. I told her I'd give her 2 weeks. I'd keep the utilities on for 2 weeks while they sorted out their accounts, but that was it. After that, I was done. She needed to go to the bank, apply for a mortgage, and handle their own affairs. She left after that, still crying but quieter. I closed the door and sat on my couch, feeling exhausted and empty. Update 1. It's been a week since that confrontation at my apartment, and things have gotten complicated in ways I didn't expect. I kept my word about the 2-week grace period on the utilities, but that's about the only thing that's gone according to plan. 3 days after my mom showed up, my dad called. It was the first time I'd actually spoken to him since Thanksgiving, and the moment I heard his voice, I felt that familiar guilt creep in. His speech was slower since the stroke, and he sounded tired. He told me he was sorry, that he didn't know Mom was going to say those things at dinner, that he'd tried to stop her, but couldn't get the words out fast enough. I believed him. Dad's cognitive issues made it hard for him to jump into confrontations, especially when he was caught off guard. He said he'd been confused about the bills, that he thought the $300 they paid me was covering their share of a roommate situation. He genuinely had no idea I'd been paying the full mortgage, the insurance, everything else. He said Mom had told him I was paying cheap rent to live there and helping out with groceries, which he thought was a fair arrangement. I asked him why he never questioned it, why he never looked at the bills himself. There was a long pause, and then he admitted he couldn't really manage that stuff anymore, that numbers got jumbled in his head and he just trusted Mom to handle it. Except Mom hadn't been handling it because she thought I was handling it, and somehow neither of them had actually realized how much I was handling. It was a mess of miscommunication and assumptions, and I could hear the genuine distress in his voice. He asked if I could come by so they could talk in person, so we could figure this out together. I told him I'd think about it. That same afternoon, I got a call from the mortgage company. They'd received my notice that I'd be moving out and wanted to clarify the situation. When I'd refinanced the house 2 years ago to get a better rate, I'd put it solely in my name because my parents couldn't qualify. The house was legally mine now, though I'd always thought of it as theirs. The mortgage rep asked what I wanted to do with the property since I was indicating I'd no longer be the primary resident. That's when it hit me. The house was mine, not theirs, mine. I'd been so focused on paying the bills and helping out that I'd never really absorbed that fact. My parents were living in a house I owned, paying me a fraction of what they should have been, and my mom had called me a freeloader at a family dinner. I told the mortgage rep I'd get back to them and spent the next few hours researching landlord-tenant law in my state. Turned out, even though there was no formal lease, my parents were legally tenants and I was their landlord. If I wanted them out, I'd have to formally evict them, which could take months. But I didn't want them out, or at least, I didn't think I did. I was angry, but not that angry. Not yet. I decided to go see them that weekend. When I arrived, the house felt different. Maybe it was just my perspective shift, or maybe it was the tension in the air. Mom answered the door looking like she hadn't slept much. Dad was in his recliner in the living room, and he looked relieved when he saw me. We sat down, and I told them we needed to have a real conversation about finances and expectations. Mom started to cry almost immediately, apologizing over and over. She said she'd made assumptions, that she'd been frustrated with other things and took it out on me, that she never meant for any of this to happen. I asked her to stop apologizing and just listen. I laid out everything clearly. The mortgage payment each month, the property taxes, the insurance, the utilities, the internet, the security system, everything. I showed them the numbers on my laptop. The total monthly cost to maintain the house was around $3,200. They'd been paying me $300. Dad looked shocked. Mom looked sick. She asked why I never told them, and I said I did tell them. I'd mentioned it when I first moved back in, but they'd seemed so overwhelmed with everything that I'd just handled it quietly. Somewhere along the way, my helping had become invisible to them. I told them the reality of the situation. The house was in my name. Legally, I owned it. I could sell it, rent it to strangers, or continue letting them live there. But if they stayed, things had to change. I told them I wanted them to stay, that I didn't want to uproot them, but we needed a formal arrangement. I proposed a lease. Market rent for a 3-bedroom house in their neighborhood was about $1,800. I'd charge them $1,200, below market, but enough to cover a significant portion of the actual costs. They'd be responsible for setting up and paying their own utilities. I'd continue to own the house and pay the mortgage, building my own equity, as any landlord would. Mom asked if I was really going to charge my own parents rent like they were strangers. I told her I'd been charging myself rent to live with my parents, apparently, so this seemed fair. She didn't have a good response to that. Dad asked if they could afford $1,200 a month, and I pulled out their budget based on what I knew about their income. His disability was around $1,600 a month, and Mom's part-time job brought in about $1,000. After medications and basic expenses, $1,200 was tight, but doable if they were careful. They'd been living below their means because I'd been subsidizing them, but they could manage this if they had to. There was a long silence. Finally, Dad said they'd do it. He said it was more than fair, that he was ashamed they'd let it get this far without understanding what I was doing for them. Mom nodded, still crying, and said she'd agree to whatever I wanted. I drew up a simple lease agreement that week. 1-year term, $1,200 monthly rent, tenants responsible for utilities, standard stuff. We all signed it. I transferred the utility accounts to their names and walked Mom through setting up payment plans with each company. Most of them were willing to waive deposits because of the circumstances and because I vouched for the transfer. The mortgage stayed in my name. The house stayed in my name. And I started thinking about what this all meant for the future. Update 2. It's been 2 months since we signed the lease, and I honestly didn't expect to be writing another update. But things have developed in a way that's made me reconsider everything about my family dynamics and my own future. The lease arrangement has been working. My parents have paid rent on time both months, and they've managed the utilities without major issues. Mom had to pick up a few extra shifts at work, and they've cut back on some expenses, but they're making it work. Dad's been doing better too. Having clear responsibilities and structure seems to have helped his cognition somewhat. His therapist said having concrete tasks and expectations can be beneficial for stroke recovery. But the thing that's really changed everything happened 3 weeks ago. My aunt called me. The same aunt who'd been at Thanksgiving dinner, who'd made that comment about kids being settled. She asked if we could meet for coffee, said she wanted to talk to me about something. I almost said no, but curiosity got the better of me. We met at a cafe near my new apartment, and she got straight to the point. She said she'd talked to my mom after everything went down, and Mom had filled her in on the actual financial situation. My aunt said she felt terrible about what had happened at Thanksgiving and that she'd made assumptions without knowing the full story. Then she told me something I didn't know. Apparently, my mom had been complaining to the extended family for years about me living at home, painting me as the unemployed loser who couldn't launch. My aunt and uncle had believed it, and so had my cousins. That's why my aunt had made that pointed comment at dinner. She'd been trying to back my mom up in what she thought was a justified attempt to kickstart my independence. My aunt apologized for believing the narrative without question, for not asking me directly about my situation. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. She told me my mom had always been like this, spinning stories to make herself look better or more sympathetic. It had been a problem my aunt had noticed since they were kids, but it had gotten worse as Mom got older. She said my grandmother, their mother, had left a will that caused a huge family rift 20 years ago. My mom had told everyone that she'd been unfairly cut out of the inheritance, that their mother had favored my aunt for no reason. The family had mostly sided with my mom because she'd been so hurt and vocal about it. But my aunt said that wasn't what happened. Their mother had left the estate evenly split, but with conditions. My mom's half was supposed to go into a trust because our grandmother knew Mom was bad with money. Mom had been furious about the trust condition, refused to accept it, and demanded a direct payout instead. When the estate executor, their mother's lawyer, refused to break the trust terms, Mom had renounced her inheritance entirely and told everyone she'd been cut out. My aunt had tried to explain the truth to family members over the years, but Mom's version was more dramatic and sympathetic, so it had stuck. That inheritance, by the way, would have been worth about $200,000 by now if Mom had just accepted the trust. Instead, she got nothing and convinced everyone she was the victim. I sat there processing this, and suddenly a lot of things about my mom made sense. The way she'd always had excuses for financial problems. The way she'd talk about being treated unfairly by bosses, friends, even store clerks. The way she told everyone I was freeloading when the reality was the opposite. My aunt said she was telling me this because she thought I deserved to know the pattern I was dealing with. She also said that if I ever wanted to sell the house, she and my uncle would be interested in buying it. They'd let my parents continue living there and would work out a fair arrangement with them. She said she knew my uncle had made that tough love comment at Thanksgiving, and they both felt bad about it now that they understood the truth. I told her I'd think about it, and we parted on better terms than I'd expected. That conversation sent me down a rabbit hole of reflection. I started thinking about other times my mom had painted herself as a victim, other stories that maybe didn't add up. I called my dad's brother, my uncle on that side, who I'd always gotten along with. I asked him some careful questions about my parents' financial history. Turned out there was more I didn't know. My parents had declared bankruptcy when I was in college, which I'd known, but I'd been told it was because of medical bills from my dad's father's cancer treatment. My uncle told me that was partly true, but the real issue was that my mom had gotten involved in a multi-level marketing scheme and had racked up massive credit card debt buying inventory she couldn't sell. The medical bills had been manageable with payment plans, but combined with the MLM debt, they'd had no choice but to file bankruptcy. My dad had wanted to fight it, to work extra jobs to pay it down, but my mom had convinced him bankruptcy was the only way. Then she told the family the medical debt story, and everyone had sympathized with her. I felt like I was discovering that my entire understanding of my mother was based on a carefully curated narrative she'd been building for decades. The worst part was realizing that she probably believed her own stories. I don't think she was maliciously lying. I think she'd convinced herself over time that her version of events was true, that she was always the wronged party, always the one struggling unfairly, always deserving of sympathy and support. And I'd enabled it by quietly handling everything, by not confronting her about the finances, by letting her believe whatever she wanted to believe. I'd allowed her to create this narrative where I was the problem instead of the solution. I went back to see my parents again last week. I asked my mom directly about the inheritance from my grandmother. She got defensive immediately, said it was ancient history and not relevant. I pressed her on it, told her what my aunt had said about the trust. She insisted my aunt was lying, that their mother had been cruel and unfair, that the trust was designed to control her. I asked her why she'd rather have nothing than accept $200,000 with reasonable conditions. She said it was the principle of the thing, that she wouldn't be treated like a child. I pointed out that refusing a massive inheritance over pride, then spending 20 years telling everyone she was cut out unfairly, seemed like a pattern of self-sabotage followed by playing the victim. She didn't like that. She said I was being cruel and siding with her sister over her. She started crying and said she couldn't believe her own son would attack her like this. Dad looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. I told her I wasn't attacking her. I was trying to understand her, to understand why she seemed to create these situations where she ended up the wrong party. I said I wanted to help, but I couldn't help if she wouldn't be honest with herself or with me about the patterns in her life. She asked me to leave, said she needed time to process what I'd said. I left, and I haven't heard from her since. Dad called me yesterday. He said Mom was really upset, that she felt betrayed by me bringing up old family issues. But then he said something interesting. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd said, and maybe I had a point. He said over their marriage, there had been a lot of times when Mom's version of events didn't quite match up with reality, but he'd learned it was easier to just go along with it than to argue. He said the stroke had made him realize how much he'd been letting her control the narrative of their lives, and he didn't want to do that anymore. He said he was proud of me for standing up for myself, even if it meant standing up to my mom. He asked if we could have lunch soon, just the two of us. I'm meeting him for lunch this weekend. As for my mom, I don't know. I'm still her landlord, and she's still my tenant paying rent on time. But the emotional relationship feels fractured in a way I'm not sure can be repaired. Maybe that's okay. Maybe some fractures are necessary for healing to happen differently.